Desperate with her stepson's uncontrollable behavior, a stepmother decides to hire a mysterious elderly woman to educate him. But what seemed to be just a lesson in discipline transforms into something no one could have predicted. What this old lady did left everyone shocked. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our emotional stories. Continuing, the scream echoed through the corridors of the Vincent mansion, followed by the shrill sound of glass shattering against the wall. Anthony closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling every muscle in his body tense. It was Isaac's third crisis that week, and it was only Tuesday. "I hate you. I hate this house. I hate everything," the childish voice reverberated, carrying a fury that no 9-year-old should know. Upstairs, more objects flew across the room. Sandra, the most recent nanny, hurried down the stairs, clutching her purse to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She was the 5th professional to give up in less than 2 months. "Mr. Vincent, I'm sorry, but I simply cannot continue," she stammered, adjusting her crooked glasses. He needs help that I don't know how to give." Anthony didn't even try to stop her from leaving. He just nodded, tired, as he watched another person flee from the hurricane his son had become. How could a man who commanded a business empire with a firm hand feel so powerless in his own home? Rebecca appeared in the living room, impeccable in her grey tailored suit, her heels echoing on the marble floor. Her face showed a mixture of irritation and contempt that had already become her standard expression in recent months. "This cannot continue, Anthony," she declared, crossing her arms. "Your son is completely out of control. The last school expelled him, no nanny can stand to stay, and now he's destroying the house. We need to take drastic action." Upstairs, the screams had transformed into muffled sobs. Anthony knew that sound. Well, it was the crying that his son tried to hide from everyone, the same that began after the traumatic divorce 3 years ago. "And what do you suggest?" he asked, running his hand over his tired face. "We've tried everything. The best therapists, the most prestigious schools, alternative methods." "Clearly we haven't tried enough," Rebecca cut in, her tone sharp as a razor. This savagery has to stop. We cannot live like this. I will not live like this." Anthony observed his new wife, so different from everything Isaac had known in his previous life. Where there had once been warmth and smiles, now there was only coldness and demands. Where there had once been understanding, now there were only ultimatums. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Isaac's arrival. The boy descended slowly, his red face stained with tears, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes, so similar to his father's, sparkled with a mixture of anger and pain. "See?" Rebecca pointed to the boy. "Look at him. That expression of defiance. That lack of respect. He needs to learn that there are consequences for his actions." Isaac stared at his stepmother with palpable hatred. "You're not my mother," he spat the words. "You never will be." "Thank God for that," Rebecca retorted, her lips curving into a humorless smile. "Because if I were, you would have already learned to behave like a civilized human being." "Enough," Anthony thundered, his authoritative voice finally emerging. But it was too late. Isaac advanced toward an expensive vase that decorated the coffee table. Before anyone could stop him, he pushed it. The sound of Chinese porcelain shattering on the floor was deafening. "That's it," he shouted, his eyes shining with held-back tears. "Break everything, just like you broke our family." Rebecca gripped Anthony's arm tightly. "You see, this is what your lack of firmness has created. But I have a solution. A friend recommended. Someone different. Maybe it's our last chance." Anthony barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on his son, who was now visibly trembling, as if that whole show of fury had drained his last energies. For a moment, he saw not the problematic boy who terrorized everyone, but the lost and hurt child his son really was. "Who?" he finally asked, his voice low and defeated. "An old lady, Mrs. Zora. She has different, unconventional methods, but they say she gets results." "An old woman?" Anthony laughed without humor. You want me to hire an elderly lady to deal with a boy who has already defeated the best professionals in the city? Rebecca squeezed his arm even tighter. What do we have to lose? Look around you, Anthony. Your house is in ruins, your son is destroyed, and we're drowning. We need help, and it needs to be now. In the silence that followed, only Isaac's heavy breathing could be heard. The boy had leaned against the wall, his eyes alternating between his father and stepmother, like a cornered animal waiting for the next attack. All right, Anthony finally yielded, feeling the weight of his defeat. Make the contact, but if this doesn't work... It will work, Rebecca affirmed, a strange gleam in her eyes. Because if it doesn't work, I don't know what will become of us. That night, as the mansion finally quieted down, no one noticed little Isaac sitting on the windowsill of his window, observing the stars with teary eyes. In his hand, a crumpled photo showed a happy family, him, his father, and his mother, smiling in a time that seemed to have existed in another life. A single tear fell on the image as he whispered to himself, I promise I'll make everyone leave, just like they did to you, Mom. Mrs. Zora's arrival at the Vincent mansion was nothing like Rebecca had imagined. She expected a stern lady with that professional air that intimidated even adults. Instead, a small, frail woman walked through the gates, carrying only a faded crochet bag and a serene smile on her wrinkled face. Mrs. Zora? Rebecca asked, barely able to hide her disappointment. The elderly woman wore a simple cotton floral dress and a pair of practical shoes that had seen better days. Just Zora, my dear, the lady replied with a soft voice, her brown eyes shining with a vivacity that contrasted with her fragile appearance. And you must be Mrs. Rebecca. Before Rebecca could respond, a crash from the second floor made both women look up. The sound of heavy footsteps and slamming doors echoed through the house. Ah, that must be young Isaac, Zora commented, still smiling. He has a strong spirit. Doesn't he? Rebecca gritted her teeth. Zora, I need to be clear. Isaac is not an ordinary child. He's difficult, extremely difficult. He's already driven away dozens of much younger professionals and you're worried that an old woman like me can't handle it, Zora completed, with an amused gleam in her eyes. Don't worry, dear. Sometimes it takes more than strength to move mountains. At that moment, Anthony entered the hall, adjusting his expensive tie with tense fingers. His eyes scanned Zora from head to toe, and Rebecca could see the same disappointment she had felt reflected in her husband's face. Mrs. Zora, he greeted dryly. I hope my wife has explained the situation. Oh yes, the elderly woman replied, slowly walking around the room, observing the details of the luxurious decoration. But you know, Mr. Vincent, sometimes what is explained to us is not exactly what we need to know. Anthony frowned, exchanging a confused look with Rebecca. Before they could question the meaning of that enigmatic phrase, a new noise caught everyone's attention. Isaac was at the top of the stairs, his eyes sparking with that familiar mixture of anger and defiance. He descended the steps slowly, like a small prince preparing for his next battle. So you're the new nanny? He asked, his voice laden with disdain. You won't last a week. Isaac, Rebecca warned, but Zora raised a hand, gently silencing her. Actually, the elderly woman replied, I'm not a nanny. I was never very good at following other people's rules. I prefer to discover my own. For the first time, something besides anger passed across Isaac's face, a hint of curiosity quickly masked by his usual expression of contempt. Whatever, he shrugged, but his eyes never left Zora's wrinkled face. You'll leave like all the others. Maybe, Zora agreed, surprising. Everyone. But before that, how about showing me your room? I heard you have an interesting collection of books. Isaac hesitated, clearly unprepared for that reaction. His gaze wavered between his parents and the elderly woman, as if looking for the trap in that simple proposal. Why do you want to see my books? He asked, suspicious. Because books tell stories, my dear, and stories reveal a lot about those who choose to read them. There was something in the way she said that, a note of understanding in her voice that made Isaac take an involuntary step backward. It was as if somehow that lady had seen beyond his mask of rebellion. "I don't have anything to show you," he muttered, but his voice had lost some of its previous hostility. "That's okay," Zora smiled, calmly sitting in a nearby armchair. "Then I'll stay here appreciating this beautiful room. You know, when you reach my age, you learn to have patience, much more patience than a 9-year-old could imagine." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest. This wasn't part of any method. She knew, but Anthony stopped her with a gentle touch on the arm. Something different was happening there, something that neither of them could fully understand. Isaac remained in the middle of the staircase, as if waging an internal battle. His fingers drummed nervously on the handrail, and his face alternated between expressions of anger and curiosity. "I have a book," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper, "about dragons." "Dragons?" Zora asked, her eyes shining. "Fascinating creatures, aren't they? So powerful, so feared, but so lonely." Something in her words made Isaac visibly shudder. For a moment, very brief, the mask of rebellion fell completely, revealing only a lost and frightened boy. Do you want to see it?" he asked, his voice betraying a vulnerability that no one had witnessed for months. "It would be an honor," Zora simply replied. As they watched Isaac guide the elderly woman up the stairs, Rebecca and Anthony exchanged perplexed looks. In less than 15 minutes, that diminutive lady had accomplished more than all the specialists in recent months. "How?" Rebecca murmured, more to herself than to her husband. But something else was happening, something none of them could suspect. When Zora passed an old family portrait on the wall, her eyes lingered for a moment on Anthony's figure. A look that carried decades of history, secrets, and pain, a story that would soon change forever the lives of everyone in that house. The first week with Mrs. Zora at the Vincent mansion was disconcerting, not because of the usual screams and broken objects, but because of their absence. The house plunged into a strange, almost supernatural silence that made Rebecca increasingly restless. Every morning, the elderly woman sat on the back porch, with a cup of tea, observing the garden as if waiting for something. Isaac invariably appeared there. At first he kept his distance, hiding behind trees or pretending to play with stones on the path, but each day he came a little closer. "What are you looking at so much?" he finally asked on a particularly cold morning, approaching the chair where Zora was sitting. "The roses," she answered simply, blowing on the steam rising from her cup. "Did you know they have their own language?" Isaac rolled his eyes but sat on the porch step. "Flowers don't talk." "Ah, but they communicate," Zora smiled, her eyes never leaving the garden. "See that one there, the white one? It's dying because no one takes care of it. But still it keeps trying to bloom. It reminds me of someone." The boy followed her gaze, his expression subtly changing. "They were my mother's favorites," he murmured, so low he could barely be heard. Before she left?" Zora completed softly. Isaac suddenly stood up as if he had received an electric shock, his eyes filled with that familiar mixture of anger and pain. "She didn't leave. She was kicked out. My father and that... Sometimes," Zora interrupted, her voice still calm, "pain makes us see things differently from how they really are." "You don't know anything," Isaac shouted, but for the first time his voice trembled. "She was perfect. She was the best mother in the world. And they... "And where is she now?" Zora asked, finally turning to face him. The question hit Isaac like a punch. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Tears began to form in his eyes. She will come back," he whispered, more to himself than to Zora. "She promised." From the other side of the garden, hidden behind the curtain of the study, Rebecca observed the scene with a mixture of fascination and concern. There was something in the way Zora conducted that conversation that deeply disturbed her. "What is she doing?" Anthony asked, approaching from behind his wife. "I don't know," Rebecca replied, without taking her eyes off the scene. "But she knows things we didn't tell her." In the garden, Zora had stood up and was walking slowly toward the rose bed. Isaac, still trembling, followed her, as if pulled by an invisible force. "Do you know what these roses need?" "The pay," elderly woman asked, kneeling with difficulty before the mistreated flowers. "Someone who understands them. Who knows that sometimes what seems like abandonment is just a different form of love?" "There's no different form of love," Isaac retorted, but his voice had lost its strength. "Love is staying, it's fighting, it's doing what's best for those we love," Zora completed, gently removing a weed, "even when it hurts so much that it feels like we're going to die." Something in the way she said that made Isaac kneel beside her. His small hands instinctively began to imitate her movements, clearing the soil around the roses. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Because I've seen many roses die, my dear. And I've seen many others reborn, stronger than before." In the study, Anthony felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. There was something familiar in Zora's voice, something that touched a distant and painful memory. "She can't stay," Rebecca suddenly declared, turning to face her husband. "Something's wrong here. She knows too much, acts as if—" "As if what?" Anthony asked, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene in the garden. "As if she already knew all of us," Rebecca completed, her voice betraying a fear she couldn't explain. In the garden, Isaac and Zora continued working in silence. The boy had dirt on his hands and face, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes were focused on the roses, as if in them he could find all the answers he was looking for. "If I take care of them," he began hesitantly, "do you think that she'll see, that she'll know?" Zora stopped what she was doing and looked deeply into the boy's eyes. "I believe she already knows, Isaac. She's known for a long time." At that moment, a gentle breeze blew through the garden, making the roses sway softly. And for the first time in a long time, Isaac cried, not the angry and explosive crying that everyone was used to, but a silent, deep crying of someone who finally finds a safe place for their pain. Rebecca closed the curtain forcefully, not wanting to see more. But Anthony remained there, paralyzed, as a strange sensation grew in his chest. It was as if somehow that scene in the garden was unearthing something he had worked very hard to forget. In the second week after Mrs. Zora's arrival, Rebecca began to notice subtle changes in Anthony's behavior. Her husband, always so focused on work, had started coming home earlier. Sometimes she caught him standing in the hallway, observing from a distance the interactions between Zora and Isaac, an indecipherable expression on his face. On a particularly tense afternoon, Rebecca found Anthony in his study, holding an old photo album that she had never seen before. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the yellowed pages. "What is that?" she asked, approaching from behind the armchair where he was sitting. Anthony abruptly closed the album. "Nothing important," he replied, but his voice sounded strange, distant. "Just some old photos." "Anthony," Rebecca said, her tone making it clear she wouldn't accept evasiveness. "What's going on? Since that woman arrived, you've been different." Before he could respond, voices from the garden caught the attention of both. It was Isaac, laughing, a sound that hadn't been heard in that house for months. Anthony abruptly stood up and walked to the window. In the garden, Zora was sitting on a stone bench, knitting something with her worn needles, while Isaac played nearby. The boy had built a sort of fort with fallen branches and dry leaves. "Do you think it's strong enough?" Zora's voice floated up to them. "Not yet," Isaac replied, focused on his task. "It needs to withstand any storm." "Like you?" Zora asked softly. The boy stopped what he was doing, his small hands frozen in the air. "I'm not strong," he murmured. "I'm weak. Everyone says so." "Who says that?" "The teachers. The nannies. Rebecca." Isaac hesitated for a moment. "My father." In the study, Anthony felt as if something cold had been poured down his back. He had never said that to his son, had he? But how many times had his silence, his absence, his inability to deal with the situation conveyed exactly that message? "You know," Zora's voice continued, "strength isn't just about enduring storms. Sometimes it's about knowing when to ask for help to build a better shelter." Isaac raised his eyes to her. "How do you always know what to say?" Because I've seen many storms, my dear, and I've seen many forts built and destroyed. There was a pause, filled only by the soft sound of knitting needles moving. Mrs. Zora, Isaac began, his voice trembling slightly. Have you ever lost someone you loved very much? The needles stopped. For a moment, a shadow passed over the elderly woman's wrinkled face. Yes, dear, I lost my son. In the study, Anthony staggered backward, as if he had been struck. Rebecca held him by the arm, alarmed by his reaction. Anthony, what is it? But he didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Zora, as if seeing her for the first time. And how did you bear it? Isaac's voice trembled even more. At first, I didn't, Zora answered honestly. I also built walls. I also wanted to push everyone away. The pain, it makes us do things we don't always understand. Isaac abandoned his branches and approached her. What happened to your son? He decided he didn't need me anymore, Zora answered, her voice carrying an old sadness. Sometimes the people we love choose paths different from ours, and as much as it hurts, we have to respect their choices. Like my mother? Isaac asked, so low he could barely be heard. No, dear. Your mother didn't choose to leave you. Sometimes, life forces us to make decisions that seem wrong to those on the outside. But love, true love never completely goes away. In the study, Rebecca observed with growing concern as Anthony leaned heavily on his desk, his face as pale as paper. Who is she really? Rebecca demanded. What aren't you telling me? But before Anthony could answer, a sharp cry cut the air. In the garden, Isaac had accidentally knocked over Zora's knitting, and a small wooden box had fallen out of her bag. Time seemed to freeze when an old photograph escaped from the box, sliding to the boy's feet. In the image, a boy who could be Isaac himself smiled at the camera, embraced by a much younger version of Mrs. Zora. This is, Isaac began, but his voice failed when his eyes met Zora's. The elderly woman didn't move to pick up the photo. Instead, her eyes turned to the study, window meeting Anthony's terrified gaze, and at that moment, decades of secrets and pain began to crumble like a house of cards in the wind. The silence that followed the discovery of the photograph was deafening. Isaac held the yellowed image with trembling hands, his eyes rapidly alternating between the photo and Zora's serene face. Why do you have a photo of my father? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Zora could answer, the study door violently opened. Anthony crossed the garden with heavy steps, closely followed by a visibly disturbed Rebecca. Put that away, he ordered dryly, trying to snatch the photo from his son's hands. But Isaac, for the first time, didn't react with anger. Instead, he held the photograph more tightly, his eyes fixed on the image of the boy who was identical to him. Dad, he said, his voice trembling, why do you look like me in this photo, and why are you with Mrs. Zora? Isaac, not now, Anthony, thundered. But there was something different in his voice. It wasn't authority, it was fear. It's time, Anthony, Zora spoke softly, rising from the bench. You can't keep running away. Running away? Rebecca intervened, her face a mask of confusion and anger. What is she talking about, Anthony? The successful businessman, the man who commanded hundreds of employees with a firm hand, seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. His hands visibly trembled when he ran his fingers through his graying hair. You had no right, he murmured to Zora, his voice carrying an old pain. You had no right to come here and... I had every right, Zora interrupted him, her voice firm but gentle. I am your mother. The shock of the revelation made Isaac drop the photo onto the grass. Rebecca staggered backward, bringing her hand to her mouth. But it was Anthony's reaction that was most impressive. He simply collapsed onto the garden bench as if his legs could no longer support him. My grandmother, Isaac whispered, his wide eyes fixed on Zora. This is impossible, Rebecca regained her voice. Anthony told me his parents were dead, that he was an orphan. It's easier to say someone is dead than to admit you abandoned them, isn't it, son? Zora spoke, her eyes never leaving Anthony's face. I didn't abandon anyone, he exploded, rising. Abruptly, you never understood, you never accepted my choices. What choices? Isaac asked, his small voice almost lost in the wind. Zora approached her grandson, her eyes full of an ancient sadness. Your father, Isaac, was very similar to you when he was your age, full of anger, of pain. No, Anthony cut in, his voice trembling. Don't do this. He also lost someone he loved very much, Zora continued, ignoring her son's protest. His father, my husband, left us when Anthony was 8 years old, and just like you, he didn't know how to deal with that loss. Isaac looked at his father as if seeing him for the first time. Is that true? Anthony didn't answer. His hands were closed in fists so tight that his knuckles had turned white. Your father decided he would never let anyone hurt him again, Zora explained gently. He built walls so high around himself that not even I could reach him anymore. And when he grew up... Enough, Anthony shouted, but his voice was choked. You have no right to come here and dig up the past. The past was never buried, son, Zora replied, taking a step in his direction. It's alive in every scream from Isaac, in every door he slams, in every tear he hides. Rebecca observed the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination. The entire image she had built of her husband was crumbling before her eyes. Why did you never tell me, she asked, her voice barely contained. Why lie about your family? Because it was easier, Zora answered for him. Wasn't it, son? Easier than admitting that you did to your own son exactly what your father did to you. The words hit Anthony like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face a mask of pain and recognition. I'm not like him, he murmured, but his voice betrayed the doubt that was beginning to erode his certainties. Isaac, who had remained silent, slowly approached his father. In his hands, the old photo trembled slightly. Dad, he called, his voice surprisingly calm, did you also get angry? Did you also break things? Anthony looked at his son, and for the first time in a long time, he really saw him, not as a problem to be solved, but as a reflection of his own childhood pain. He began, but his voice failed. The tears he had held back for decades began to stream down his face. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of the wind in the garden trees. And at that moment, as father and son faced each other, something began to change at the Vincent mansion. Something that not even Rebecca, with all her control and planning, could have predicted or prevented. That night, the Vincent mansion remained plunged into a silence different from all others. It wasn't the tense silence of contained fights, nor the heavy silence of unspoken words. It was a silence of transformation, like the one that precedes dawn. Rebecca had retired to her room, claiming a strong headache. In truth, she needed space to process how her entire married life had been built on lies. Every story Anthony had told about his childhood, every explanation about his family, everything was false. In the study, Anthony remained seated in his leather armchair, the old photo album open on his lap. His hands distractedly caressed the yellowed pages, as if through this gesture he could recover lost time. You kept all of them, a soft voice surprised him. Zora was standing at the door, her kind eyes fixed on her son. I said I didn't want to talk, he responded, but his voice had lost its usual hardness. No, Zora agreed, entering anyway. You never do, just like your son. Anthony closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that comparison. Why did you come back? After so long? Because. History has a strange way of repeating itself, she replied, sitting in the chair across from him. And sometimes we need to go back to fix what broke. Nothing is broken, he tried to argue, but the words sounded empty even to his own ears. No? Zora questioned softly. Then why does your son scream the same way you screamed? Why does he break things like you broke? Why does he push everyone away like you pushed away? The words hit Anthony like precise arrows. His hands began to tremble over the album. I am not like my father, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I didn't abandon my son. No, Zora agreed, not physically. But there are many forms of abandonment, son. You built an empire, but forgot to build bridges, exactly like your father did. Upstairs, Isaac was sitting on the windowsill of his window, observing the stars. In his hands, the photo he had found earlier, his father as a child smiling next to Mrs. Zora. It was strange to see his father like this, so similar to himself, so vulnerable. A light knock on the door startled him. It was Rebecca, looking strangely hesitant. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice stripped of its usual authority. Isaac shrugged, his habitual gesture of indifference, but there was something different in his eyes, a curiosity that wasn't there before. "Did you know?" he asked as she approached. "About Mrs. Zora?" "No," Rebecca replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Your father, he never talked about his family. Now I understand why." There was a moment of silence between them, not entirely comfortable, but less hostile than usual. "You know," Rebecca began, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes people carry pains so great that they don't know how to deal with them, and they end up hurting those nearby." Isaac looked at her, surprised by the gentle tone in her voice. "Like my father?" "Like all of us," she replied, surprising herself with the honesty. Maybe I too have tried to fix things the wrong way." In the study, Anthony finally found the courage to ask the question that tormented him. "How did you know about Isaac? How did you know he was like I was?" Zora smiled sadly. "Mothers always know, son, even when their children think they've forgotten them." She slowly rose and walked to the bookshelf, where a photo of baby Isaac was framed. "Besides, I never really left. I always kept an eye on you, on your life. I saw when you got married, when Isaac was born, when your marriage ended." "For you could have appeared before," Anthony accused, but his voice was more hurt than angry. "No," she disagreed gently. "You weren't ready. Sometimes we need to see our own mistakes reflected in another person to finally understand them." That moment, a familiar sound echoed through the house. Isaac was playing the piano. It was a simple, hesitant melody, something he had learned before all the chaos began. Anthony hadn't heard that sound in months. "He still plays," Zora commented, her eyes shining with held-back tears. "Even after everything, there's music inside him, just like there was in you." Anthony rose abruptly, walking to the window. The music continued, each note carrying an emotion that words couldn't express. "What if," he began, his voice choked. "What if it's too late? What if I don't know how to fix this?" Zora approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to rebuild bridges, son. I'm here, aren't I?" The next morning, the routine at the Vincent mansion began differently. For the first time in months, Anthony didn't leave early for work. Instead, he remained seated at the breakfast table, observing his son distractedly poking at the scrambled eggs he had barely touched. The silence was heavy, laden with unasked questions. Rebecca had opted to have breakfast in her room, leaving father and son alone with Mrs. Zora, who calmly poured more coffee into her cup. "Did you play the piano too?" Isaac finally asked, his small voice breaking the silence. Anthony almost dropped his cup, surprised by the question. His eyes met his mother's for a brief moment before returning to his son. "Yes," he answered hesitantly. "For many years." "Why did you stop?" The simple question hit Anthony like a punch to the stomach. He found himself transported back in time, to the day he closed the lid of the piano in his childhood home for the last time. "Because," he began, but the words got stuck in his throat. "Because music makes us feel," Zora completed softly. "And your father decided he didn't want to feel anything anymore." Isaac put down his fork, his eyes fixed on his father. "Was it after your father left?" Anthony felt his hands begin to tremble. How to explain to a son the same type of pain he was causing? How to admit that he had become exactly what he most feared? "I was about your age," he began, his voice hoarse. "One day I woke up and he simply wasn't there anymore." "Like my mother," Isaac murmured, his eyes filling with tears. "No," Anthony quickly replied, perhaps too quickly. "Your mother is different." "Why? Because she calls once in a while? Because she sends presents on special dates?" Isaac's voice began to rise, that familiar anger returning to the surface. She still left. Isaac, Zora intervened gently. Sometimes the people we love need to leave for a while to heal. But why did she need to heal from me? The boy shouted, rising abruptly from the table. What did I do wrong? The question echoed through the room, carrying a pain so deep it made Anthony feel as if his heart was being ripped from his chest. It was the same question he himself had asked so many times as a child. Nothing, he found himself saying, his voice trembling. You did nothing wrong, son. Then why does no one stay? Isaac asked, tears now flowing freely down his face. Why does everyone leave? Before Anthony could answer, Zora slowly rose from her chair. Come with me, she said to Isaac, extending her wrinkled hand. I want to show you something. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Isaac took the offered hand. Zora guided him to the piano in the music room, that same piano that for months had served only as decoration. Do you know why music is so special? She asked, sitting on the bench and inviting her grandson to sit beside her. Because it allows us to say things that words can't. Her elderly fingers played some soft notes, a simple and melancholic melody. This was your father's favorite song when he was your age. Anthony, who had followed the two to the door of the music room, felt his heart stop. That melody, how long had it been since he heard it? He played it when he was sad, Zora continued, her hands moving gently over the keys. When he was angry, when he felt homesick. Isaac watched his grandmother's fingers with fascination. Did you teach him? Yes, she smiled. And do you know what else I taught him? The boy shook his head negatively. That sometimes, when words fail, music can build bridges. Bridges between the past and the present, between pain and healing. Between people who have lost each other. She stopped playing and looked directly at Anthony, who remained paralyzed at the door. Some bridges take years to rebuild, but it's never too late to start. Isaac also looked at his father, and at that moment something passed between them. A silent understanding, a shared pain. Dad, he called, his voice small again. Can you play that song again? Anthony felt his legs tremble as he walked to the piano. How long had it been since he last played? 20 years? More? His hands hovered over the keys, hesitant. I don't know if I still remember, he whispered. Some things, Zora said softly. The heart never forgets. And there, on that morning of changes, the first notes of an old melody began to echo through the Vincent mansion, building note by note a new bridge over long turbulent waters. 2 weeks had passed since Anthony had played the piano for the first time in decades. The Vincent mansion, previously a battlefield of contained emotions, was beginning to breathe a different air. But not all changes were tranquil, and some wounds, when exposed, hurt even more. Rebecca observed these transformations with a mixture of fascination and fear. Her control over the house, once absolute, was slipping through her fingers like water. In recent nights, she had begun to notice Anthony's increasingly frequent absences from bed. He spent hours in the study, immersed in old photographs and memories he had never shared with her. On a particularly tense afternoon, she found him silently crying over an old newspaper clipping. What is that? She asked, approaching from behind the armchair where he was sitting. Anthony didn't try to hide the tears, something that weeks ago would have been unthinkable. My father's obituary, he answered, his voice hoarse. He died 5 years ago. I never went to the funeral. Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. Why did you never tell me? Because I had convinced myself it didn't matter, he replied, running his hand over his tired face, that he had lost the right to be my father the day he left. And now. He hesitated, looking out the window where Isaac was playing in the garden with Mrs. Zora. Now I understand that I was becoming exactly like him. In the garden, Zora was teaching Isaac to plant new roses. The boy, who previously destroyed everything he touched, now handled the buds with surprising care. How did you know they would survive? He asked his grandmother, referring to the roses they had recovered weeks ago. Because even the most hurt things have the strength to be reborn, she replied, helping him secure a seedling in the soil. "You just need to give time and care, like you did with my father." Zora stopped what she was doing, her eyes meeting those of her grandson. "I tried, but sometimes, Isaac, people need to get lost before they can find themselves." "Did he get lost because of my grandfather?" "In part," she sighed, "but also because he didn't know how to deal with the pain, so instead of facing it, he decided not to feel anything." Isaac absorbed those words in silence, his small hands continuing to work in the soil. "I do that too," he admitted after a while, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes, when it hurts too much, I prefer to be angry." "I know, dear," Zora replied, softly. "Your father did the same thing." In the study, Rebecca had sat down beside her husband. For the first time since they married, she saw him truly vulnerable. "Why now?" she asked. "Why let your mother come back after so long?" Anthony closed his eyes, remembering the moment he saw Zora for the first time after 2 decades. "Because when I saw Isaac breaking everything, yelling at everyone, I saw myself, and it scared me. Are you afraid he'll become like you?" "No," Anthony replied, his voice trembling. "I'm afraid he already is like me, and that it's too late to change." In the garden, Isaac had stopped planting and was now observing a butterfly that had landed on one of the recovered roses. "Grandma," he called, the word sounding strange and at the same time natural in his mouth. "Do you think Mom will come back someday?" Zora sat beside him, her soil-covered hands seeking his. "I don't know, dear. But do you know what I do know?" "What?" "That you're not alone. That you never were." At that moment, Anthony appeared at the garden door. His eyes were red, but there was something different in his posture, a vulnerability that made him more human. "Dad?" Isaac called, noticing his presence. Do you want to see the roses that Grandma taught me to plant?" Anthony felt his heart tighten. It was the first genuine invitation he had received from his son in months. "I do," he replied, his voice choked. "I really do." As father and son approached the rose bushes, Rebecca watched from the study window. Something was changing in that house, something deep and irreversible, and for the first time, she wondered if perhaps this change wasn't exactly what they all needed. On her bench in the garden, Zora smiled, watching her son and grandson kneel together in the soil. Some seeds she knew needed time to germinate, but when they finally sprouted, they were capable of breaking even the hardest concrete. In the 3rd week after Zora's revelation, an unexpected storm hit the city. The thunder made the Vincent mansion tremble and lightning illuminated the corridors like ghostly flashes. It was on one of these stormy nights that something finally broke, not from anger, but from necessity. Isaac woke up screaming, soaked in sweat. The nightmare had been so real. His mother leaving again, but this time taking his father and grandmother too, leaving him completely alone. His screams echoed through the house, but different from previous ones. There was no anger in them, only pure and vulnerable fear. Anthony was the first to reach his son's room, closely followed by Zora. They found Isaac huddled in bed, trembling, his small hands clutching the sheets as if they were his only anchor to reality. "Son?" Anthony called softly, approaching cautiously. It was the first time in months he had entered Isaac's room during a crisis. "Don't go away," the boy sobbed, his voice broken. "Please, don't go away too." Something broke inside Anthony. Without thinking twice, he sat on the bed and pulled his son into his arms. To his surprise, instead of resisting as he always did, Isaac clung to him as if his life depended on it. "I'm not going anywhere," Anthony whispered, his own voice choked. "Never again." A particularly strong thunder made the windows shudder. Isaac curled up even more in his father's arms. "Is this how you felt?" he asked between sobs, "when your father left?" Anthony closed his eyes tightly, feeling tears escape from between his eyelids. "Yes," he admitted, "exactly like this." From the door, Zora observed the scene with a heavy heart. How many nights had she wished she could comfort her own son in that same way? How many times had Anthony cried alone, refusing her comfort? "I'm so afraid," Isaac confessed, his voice muffled against his father's chest, "afraid of waking up and finding that everyone has gone again." "I had that fear too," Anthony replied, caressing his son's hair. "That's why I built so many walls. I thought if I didn't let anyone in, no one could hurt me." "Did it work?" "No," he laughed without humor. "It only made me more alone. And worse, it made you feel alone too." Another lightning illuminated the room, revealing Rebecca standing silently behind Zora. Her eyes were tearful, her usual mask of control completely dissolved. "Do you know what I wanted most at that time?" Anthony continued, his voice low and confessional. "For someone to tell me it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't done anything wrong." Isaac raised his head, his eyes meeting his father's. "But you never told me that." "Because I never believed it myself," Anthony admitted, feeling his heart tighten. "Until I saw you going through the same pain. Then I realized that if you weren't to blame, maybe I wasn't either." Zora chose this moment to approach, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Neither of you is to blame," she said softly. "Sometimes, the people we love hurt us not because we want them to, but because they themselves are hurt." "Like my mother?" Isaac asked, his voice small. "Like your mother," Anthony confirmed. "Like my father. Like me." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of rain beating against the windows. Isaac still trembled slightly in his father's arms, but his sobs had decreased. "Dad," he called after a moment. "Yes?" Can you stay here until I fall asleep?" Anthony felt his heart expand in a way he no longer believed possible. "I can stay as long as you need." From the door, Rebecca observed the scene with a growing understanding. All her effort to discipline Isaac, all her attempts to impose order, none of it had touched the true root of the problem. What the boy needed, what they all needed, was simply love. As the storm continued outside, something was beginning to heal inside the Vincent mansion. It was as if each thunder took with it a piece of the old pain. Each lightning illuminated a new path to healing. And there, that night, as Isaac finally fell asleep in his father's arms, the last barriers began to crumble, not with the violence of destruction, but with the gentleness of forgiveness. The morning that followed the storm brought more than just clear skies to the Vincent mansion. It also brought an unexpected visit. Hannah, Isaac's mother, was standing in the entrance hall, her hands nervously clutching the strap of her purse. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca asked, being the first to encounter her. Her voice, normally cutting when it came to Anthony's ex-wife, sounded merely tired. I saw the photos," Hannah replied, her voice trembling slightly. "The photos that Isaac posted in the family group. Him smiling, playing piano with Anthony. Who is that lady with them?" Before Rebecca could answer, Zora appeared at the top of the stairs. Her serene eyes met Hannah's, and something passed between the two women, a silent understanding that transcended words. "You must be Hannah," Zora said softly, descending the steps. "I am Zora, Anthony's mother." Hannah blinked, surprised. "But Anthony said his parents were dead?" Zora completed with a sad smile. "Sometimes it's easier to bury the past than to face it." The sound of footsteps in the upper corridor made them all turn. Isaac had just left his room and was now paralyzed at the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on his mother. "Mom," he whispered, his voice a mixture of hope and fear. Hannah took a step forward, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Hi, my love." But Isaac didn't run to hug her as he used to do. Instead, he took a step back, his body tense like a violin string about to break. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You said you needed time, that you needed to heal." "I know, my dear, and I still need to," Hannah answered honestly. "But when I saw those photos, you looked so different, so happy," Isaac completed, a note of bitterness in his voice. "Yeah, sometimes. I managed to be happy even without you." The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah seemed to have been slapped, her hands clutching her purse even tighter. It was Zora who broke the tense moment, calmly climbing the steps until she reached Isaac. "You know, dear, sometimes anger is like a wall we build to protect ourselves from pain, but it also prevents us from receiving the love that's still there." Isaac looked at his grandmother, tears beginning to stream down his face. "But it hurts so much." "I know," Zora replied, caressing his face. "Believe me, I know." At that moment, Anthony emerged from his study, stopping abruptly when he saw the scene unfolding. "Hannah," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, "why didn't you let us know you were coming?" "I didn't plan to," she admitted. "But those photos... Anthony, what happened here? How..." "It happened that some bridges needed to be rebuilt," Zora answered for him, still keeping a protective hand on Isaac's shoulder. "And some truths needed to be faced." Hannah looked at her ex-husband, really seeing him for the first time in years. He seemed different, softer, more present. "You're playing the piano again," she observed. "I am," Anthony replied, a small smile appearing on his lips. "Isaac has been helping me remember the songs." "And the roses," Isaac suddenly added, his voice still trembling but with a touch of pride. "Grandma and I planted new roses in the garden." Hannah felt more tears escape. "You always loved those roses." "Like you," he replied. And for the first time since she arrived, his voice sounded more hurt than angry. Zora gently guided Isaac down the stairs. "Why don't we show the roses to your mother? Sometimes flowers have a special way of helping us say what words can't." Isaac hesitated, looking first at his father, then at Rebecca, who remained silently observing everything, and finally at his mother. "Are you going to leave again?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. Hannah felt her heart break. "Yes," she answered honestly. I still can't." "But that doesn't mean the love is gone," Zora completed softly. "Isn't that right, Hannah?" Hannah nodded, tears flowing freely down her face. It never left. And there, in the hall of the Vincent mansion, another wall began to crumble, not with the violence of destruction, but with the courage of truth. The rose garden became the setting for one of the most delicate moments in the history of the Vincent family. Hannah walked slowly among the beds, following Isaac, who, with a mixture of pride and hesitation, showed each new plant he had planted with Zora's help. "This one here," he explained, pointing to a rose that was beginning to bloom, "was almost dead, but Grandma taught me that even the most hurt flowers can bloom again." Hannah swallowed hard, perfectly understanding the unintentional metaphor in her son's words. Her eyes met Zora's, who observed the scene with that serenity that seemed never to leave her. "You were always good at taking care of things," Hannah said softly, "even when you were tiny." "Then why didn't you let me take care of you?" Isaac asked abruptly, his voice carrying an old pain. The silence that followed was heavy. Anthony, who was observing everything from a respectful distance, took a step forward, but Zora stopped him with a gentle gesture. "Because sometimes," Hannah began, choosing her words carefully, "the person who most needs care is the one who least knows how to receive it. Like me," Anthony found himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself. "Like I did with my mother." Isaac looked from his father to his mother, then to his grandmother, as if trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle too complex for his age. "But Grandma came back," he argued. "She didn't give up." "No," Zora agreed softly, "because sometimes love needs to wait for the right moment. Like these roses, there's no use forcing them to bloom before their time." Hannah knelt on the grass, coming to eye level with her son. Her hands trembled when she extended them, not quite touching Isaac, but offering the gesture. "I didn't give up on you, my love," she said, her voice choked. "I gave up on myself, and I realized I couldn't be the mother you deserved until you healed," Isaac completed, repeating the words he had heard so many times. "Yes," she confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "But seeing you here, taking care of these roses, smiling again, makes me think that maybe I can learn to bloom again too." Rebecca, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. "Roses need space to grow," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. but they also need to know they have a place to return to. Everyone looked at her, surprised by the change in her usual tone. Zora smiled, recognizing that she wasn't the only one who had learned important lessons in those weeks. "You can come see the roses whenever you want," Isaac said after a long moment, his voice small but firm. They'll take a while to grow completely. "Like us," Hannah replied, understanding the message between the lines. Anthony approached, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said, looking at his own mother, "we need a lifetime to learn to grow the right way." Zora observed the scene with teary eyes. There, among the roses that symbolized so many stories of loss and new beginnings, a new understanding was beginning to bloom. It wasn't a simplistic happy ending, nor a magical resolution for years of pain. It was something deeper, more truthful, the recognition that love, like roses, needs time, patience, and above all, the courage to allow each to bloom in their own time. "Grandma," Isaac called, extending his small hand to her, "can you teach us that song again? The one Dad played when he was little?" "Of course, my love," she replied, taking his hand. "Hannah, would you like to hear it?" Hannah hesitated for a moment, looking at Anthony for permission. He nodded slightly. "I'd love to," she replied. And so the group left the rose garden, walking toward the music room. Each step was like a note in a new melody that was beginning to be composed. Not perfect, not complete, but honest in its imperfection. Rebecca was the last to follow them, pausing for a moment to look at the roses. A solitary petal fell from one of the flowers, dancing in the wind before gently landing on the grass. Like that petal, she thought, sometimes we need to allow ourselves to fall to discover a new path to grow. Autumn arrived at the Vincent mansion, bringing with it a gentle change in the air. The roses in the garden, now fully bloomed, danced with the breeze, their petals spreading perfume through the morning air. 3 months had passed since that day in the garden, and the house breathed a different rhythm. In the music room, where silence once reigned, piano notes now echoed almost every afternoon. Isaac and Anthony had transformed that space into their private refuge, a place where unspoken words found expression through music. On this particular morning, however, something special was about to happen. Hannah had begun making regular visits, always on Sundays, to see the roses and hear Isaac play. But today was different. It was her son's birthday. "Are you nervous?" Zora asked her grandson, helping him adjust the bow tie he had insisted on wearing. "A little," he admitted, his fingers drumming restlessly against his leg. "What if I miss the notes?" "Then it will be an even more special song," she smiled, adjusting a rebellious lock of his hair. "Because it will be true." In the room, guests were beginning to arrive. It wasn't a big party, just family and a few close friends. Hannah conversed softly with Rebecca in a corner, the two women having found common ground in their love for Isaac. The old tension between them had been replaced by mutual respect, born from the understanding that there was enough room in the boy's heart for everyone. Anthony observed the final preparations with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "He chose the song we're going to play together," he told his mother when she approached. "The same one you used to play?" Zora asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," he smiled, his eyes teary. "The one you taught me when I was his age." The Tari's moment arrived. Isaac entered the room, his small hands intertwined with his father's. There was no longer that anger in his eyes, that latent pain that once consumed him. In its place there was a different light, not of complete joy, but of peace under construction. "Before we begin," he said, his voice clear and firm, surprising everyone, "I want to say something." Silence fell over the room. Hannah held Rebecca's hand instinctively, both holding their breath. "When Grandma arrived here," Isaac continued, "I thought nothing could get better, that the pain would stay forever. But she taught me that sometimes we need to let things break completely to be able to rebuild them in a new way." Zora felt silent tears running down her wrinkled face. "Mom," he turned to Hannah, "I understand now that you needed to heal. And Dad, I understand that you were hurt too. And Rebecca." He hesitated for a moment. "Thank you for not giving up on us, even when I made everything so difficult." Anthony sat at the piano and Isaac took his place beside him. His fingers found the keys with a familiarity that months before had seemed impossible. The first notes of the old melody filled the room. But there was something different about it now. It was no longer a song of sadness or longing. It was a song of new beginnings, of healing, of love that persists even through the most violent storms. As they played, Zora observed her family gathered. Rebecca, who had learned that love wasn't control. Hannah, who was finding courage to heal without abandoning the ties that kept her connected. Anthony, who had finally torn down the walls that prevented him from feeling. And Isaac, her precious grandson, who had learned that some flowers need time to bloom. The music came to an end, but its echo remained in the air, like a silent promise. Isaac looked at each face in the room, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Grandma," he called softly, "you were right. Some broken things can be fixed, not the same way they were before, but in a new way," she completed, "and sometimes even more beautiful." That afternoon, as the autumn sun painted golden shadows through the windows of the Vincent mansion, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't a grand miracle or a magical transformation. It was something much more precious, the moment when a family learned that love, like music, doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. And in the garden the roses continued to bloom, silent witnesses that even in the most unlikely places, even after the most devastating storms, life always finds a way to be reborn.